February 8th, 1944. The North Atlantic, 200 miles north of Iceland. Chief Petty Officer William Thompson braced himself against the galley counter as HMS Fortitude rolled through another 15-foot swell, ice cascading off the destroyer's superstructure like frozen waterfalls. Through the porthole, he watched a sailor collapse on the forward gun mount. The man crumpled mid-stride, his body hitting the deck with a thud that Thompson felt through the steel beneath his boots. Two shipmates dragged him toward the hatch, his legs trailing behind him like dead weight. The gunner was the third man to go down that morning. It wasn't even 900 hours. Thompson turned back to his domain, a galley barely 8 feet square, wedged between the engine room's furnace heat and the Arctic's killing cold. On the counter sat the morning's breakfast rations, bully beef frozen solid in its tin, hardtack biscuits that could crack teeth, tea that turned to slush before a man finished drinking it. Standard Royal Navy fare, designed for temperate waters, not this frozen hell where the thermometer hadn't climbed above -20 in 8 days. He watched his crew shuffle through the mess line, hollow-eyed and gaunt. Some couldn't finish their portions. Their jaws ached from chewing rock-hard bread. They were eating, but they were starving anyway. Malnutrition was spreading through the ship like a ghost, invisible but lethal. Men stumbled at their posts. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. The doctor had pulled him aside yesterday, voice tight with frustration. They need calories, real fuel, not this frozen nonsense. Thompson stared at the dwindling supplies and felt the weight of every man on this ship pressing down on his shoulders. What the War Office would later dismiss as one cook's absurd improvisation was about to become the secret that kept 15,000 Arctic convoy sailors alive. For 18 months, the Arctic convoys had been running a gauntlet that Winston Churchill himself called the worst journey in the world. The routes stretched from Iceland to Murmansk, 1,000 miles of frozen ocean where the Barents Sea turned to slush and the sun barely rose above the horizon. These weren't glamorous missions. No newsreels captured them. No Hollywood films would immortalize them. Just merchant vessels packed with tanks, ammunition, and hope, escorted by destroyers whose crews learned quickly that the cold killed faster than any German torpedo. The statistics backed up the terror. Convoy PQ-17, decimated in July 1942, lost 24 of 35 merchant ships. Over 4 million tons of cargo went to the bottom. But those numbers only told half the story. The other half was written in the medical logs, in the long columns tracking hypothermia, frostbite, and what the doctors euphemistically called cold exhaustion. Men didn't just die from U-boats and Luftwaffe bombs. They died because their bodies simply ran out of fuel. Operating in temperatures plunging. Below -30°C, Royal Navy sailors faced conditions that made a mockery of standard rations. The Ministry of Supply had calculated daily caloric requirements based on North Sea operations, moderate weather, reasonable temperatures. They'd allocated 3,200 calories per man per day, packed into tins of bully beef, condensed milk, hardtack biscuits, and tea. It should have been enough. It wasn't. Not even close. Arctic operations demanded a different calculation. Men working 18-hour watches in sub-zero cold burned calories like furnaces. Just maintaining core body temperature consumed energy at rates the ministry's peacetime nutritionists had never considered. A sailor chipping ice off a gun mount for 6 hours could burn 5,000 calories. A stoker working the engine rooms, shuttling between infernal heat and Arctic wind, could burn 6,000. The gap between intake and expenditure was a death sentence measured in weeks. What made the situation particularly devastating was how the cold weaponized the food itself. Bully beef, that staple of British military rations since the Boer War, turned to concrete overnight. Men needed knives to chip portions from the tins. Hardtack biscuits, already notorious for their jaw-breaking density, became literally stone-like. Butter solidified into yellow rocks. Even hot tea cooled to ice before a man could finish his mug. Sailors were presented with rations they physically couldn't consume fast enough to get the calories they desperately needed. Ship's doctors documented the progression with clinical precision. First came the exhaustion, men moving slower, thinking slower. Then the tremors, hands shaking so badly they couldn't grip tools. Then the collapses, bodies simply surrendering to caloric bankruptcy. By week 3 of a typical convoy run, 20% of crews showed symptoms of malnutrition. By week 4, some ships reported men too weak to stand watch. Commander Jeffrey Wilson, captain of HMS Beagle, wrote in his log, "The cold is a more effective enemy than anything Dunitz has deployed. My gunners can fight U-boats. They cannot fight starvation disguised as standard rations." The Admiralty knew they had a problem. In late 1943, they'd commissioned a study on Arctic nutrition requirements. The report, delivered in January 1944, recommended increasing rations to 4,500 calories per day, with emphasis on high-fat, high-protein foods that could be consumed quickly. The recommendations were marked under review and filed. Implementation would require logistical restructuring across the entire North Atlantic fleet. It would take months, maybe years. The men on the Arctic run didn't have months. They had the convoys scheduled for February, March, April. They had the supplies already loaded into ships already at sea. And they had cooks who understood something the Ministry of Supply didn't. When doctrine fails, improvisation becomes doctrine. The officers didn't understand. How could they? They ate in the wardroom, where meals arrived on china plates, where tea stayed hot in silver pots insulated from the cold. First Lieutenant Ashford had actually laughed when Thompson requested additional fat rations. "What exactly do you propose to do with extra lard, Carrion? Grease the deck guns?" The comment had rippled through the officers' mess as a joke. The cook who wanted butter like it was ammunition. But Ashford hadn't watched a 19-year-old gunner's mate try to chew frozen beef with gums that bled from scurvy. He hadn't seen stokers collapse after 6-hour watches, their bodies cannibalizing muscle because they'd burned through every calorie from breakfast before lunch arrived. Ashford commanded from the bridge, where wind chill was measured but not felt. Not the way the deck crews felt it. Not in the bone-deep way that made men forget their own names. "You don't fight the war with soup, Thompson," Ashford had said, voice dripping with the particular contempt officers reserved for enlisted men who questioned procedure. "Stick to your pots. Leave strategy to those trained for it." What they didn't realize, what Ashford and his War Office superiors couldn't see from their heated offices and insulated wardrooms, was that logistics is strategy. "An army marches on its stomach," Napoleon had said. A navy sailed on the same principle. The finest destroyer in the Royal Navy was just an expensive coffin if her crew was too weak to fight. The Ministry of Supply's confidence bordered on arrogance. They'd calculated, calibrated, allocated. The rations had been scientifically determined by nutritionists who'd never felt Arctic wind cut through wool like it wasn't there. The portions had been measured by logistics officers who'd never watched a man try to eat frozen butter with fingers that no longer bent. Everything was optimal, on paper, in London, in rooms where the tea stayed warm. Meanwhile, 300 miles north, reality told a different story. HMS Achilles reported 8 men hospitalized for malnutrition in 1 week. HMS Javelin logged 12 cases of advanced frostbite, all in crew members who'd shown signs of caloric deficiency. The destroyer Oribe lost a man when he fell asleep on watch, too exhausted to stay conscious. He'd eaten his full ration that morning. It simply wasn't enough. Thompson had tried going through proper channels. He'd submitted a requisition for additional condensed milk and beef fat, citing the caloric requirements he'd observed. The form came back stamped, "Denied. Rations adequate per ministry standard." He'd tried explaining to the ship's doctor, who'd agreed completely, but had no authority to override supply regulations. He'd even mentioned it to the captain during an inspection, only to be told, "Make do with what you have, Thompson. That's what we all do." But making do was killing his crew. So Thompson stopped asking permission. He stopped filing requisitions. And he started doing what cooks throughout history have done when official doctrine fails. He improvised. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Arctic convoys. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about these brutal missions before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II's forgotten stories, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. It started at 0200 hours with frustration and desperation. Thompson stood alone in his galley, staring at what the mess crew called slop, the leftover scraps that usually went over the side, congealed oatmeal from breakfast, a half tin of beef fat skimmed from the week's stew, condensed milk gone thick and sweet, a precious bag of sugar, rationed like ammunition, garbage, scraps. Nothing a sane cook would look at twice. But Thompson wasn't thinking like a cook anymore. He was thinking like an engineer. Men were machines. Machines needed fuel. The thin stews and frozen bread weren't cutting it. What his crew needed was something dense, something that packed maximum calories into minimum volume, something that wouldn't freeze solid and could be eaten quickly between watches. He lit the stove and waited for it to heat. Then he made a decision that would either save lives or get him court-martialed. He dumped the beef fat into his largest pot and watched it liquefy, the rendered animal fat turning translucent under the flame. The smell filled the tiny galley, rich and heavy. He added the oatmeal, stirring until it formed a thick paste, then poured in the condensed milk. The mixture bubbled and hissed. He added sugar, more than any recipe would call for, and a heavy pinch of salt. The combination looked like industrial sludge, gray-brown and glistening, more chemistry experiment than food. Thompson let it cook for 20 minutes, stirring constantly, watching the ingredients merge into something new, something that might work, or might poison his entire crew. He poured the mixture into a shallow tin pan and carried it to the one cold spot in the galley, where the bulkhead touched the outer hull. Within an hour, it had solidified into something with the consistency of dense cake and the weight of a brick. He cut a square, 2 inches by 2 inches. It felt substantial in his hand, heavy. He took a bite. The texture was chewy, almost waxy, with a sweetness that fought against the fatty richness. It tasted unlike anything he'd ever made before. Not good, exactly. Not terrible. Just different. But it sat in his stomach like ballast, heavy and satisfying in a way the watery soup never had. One small piece filled him up more than a full bowl of regulation stew. The next morning, Thompson served his experiment alongside regular rations. He placed the squares on plates without explanation, without fanfare. The crew stared at them like he'd served motor oil. "What the hell is this, Cookie?" "Fuel," Thompson said simply. "Just eat it." Able Seaman Richards picked up a square, sniffed it, made a face. "Smells like someone cooked the engine room." He took a cautious bite and laughed, but it was a tired laugh, the kind men make when they're too exhausted for real humor. "Christ, Thompson's Arctic brick. This is awful, mate." But by midday, the jokes had stopped. Richards was still standing watch, while other gunners who'd skipped the brick were flagging. He had energy. He was warm. 6 hours into his watch, While men around him shivered and stumbled, Richards was solid. By dinner, word had spread through the ship. Half the crew lined up asking for the bricks. Thompson worked through the night, refining his recipe, scaling up production. He scavenged every scrap. Leftover porridge from breakfast, beef fat skimmed from lunch stew, condensed milk thinned with water. He hung tins near the engine room steam pipes to thaw frozen ingredients. Nothing was wasted. The bricks evolved. Thompson added cocoa powder, stolen in small quantities from the officers' stores. He experimented with dried fruit, raisins that rehydrated in the hot mixture. He pressed the mixture thinner so men could carry pieces in their coat pockets. Each batch was a small revolution, born from trial and error in a space so cramped he could touch both walls at once. The transformation was subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Men who'd been shuffling through shifts with dead eyes started moving faster, standing straighter. The gun crews on deck stopped collapsing after 6-hour watches. Morning sick call, which had averaged 15 men per day, dropped to 7, then 5. One morning, Stoker Davies gripped Thompson's shoulder with a scarred hand. "I don't know what you're doing, Cookie, but keep doing it. I've got kids back home. I'd like to see them again." Thompson nodded, throat tight. He couldn't articulate it, couldn't explain that he was flying blind, that every batch was part science and part prayer, that he lived in terror that the next one might make someone sick. So he just kept cooking. Then came the afternoon that proved everything. February 16th, 1944. The Luftwaffe found them at 14:30 hours. Ju-88 bombers screamed out of low clouds, their shadows racing across the ice-choked sea. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, the air filled with flak and smoke and the shriek of falling bombs. Thompson grabbed a pot of his bricks and kicked open the galley hatch. The assistant cook shouted at him, "You're mad!" Thompson ignored him. He stepped onto the deck into hell. Wind hit like a fist. Cold was instant, absolute. Explosions hammered the water around them. He crawled toward the forward gun mount, the pot clutched to his chest, ice forming on his eyebrows before he'd covered 10 feet. The gun crew stared like he was a ghost. 4 men, faces blackened with powder burns, hands raw from handling frozen shells. Thompson shoved bricks into their hands. "Eat now. Keep shooting." They ate standing, gulping down the dense cakes between salvos, shoving them into mouths with numb fingers. Thompson watched them come back to life, watched color return to gray faces, watched hands steady on the firing mechanisms. "Christ, Cookie," the lead gunner shouted over the chaos. "You trying to get killed?" Thompson grinned through chattering teeth. "Haven't decided yet." He made 3 more trips, to the aft guns, to the bridge lookouts, to the depth charge racks. Each time, the cold tried to kill him. Each time, he hauled his pot through the chaos because men couldn't fight on empty stomachs. When the attack finally ended and the bombers vanished into the northern sky, Thompson collapsed in his galley, hands shaking, blood trickling from his nose where the cold had cracked the skin. The assistant cook whispered, "You're insane." Thompson laughed. "Maybe, but they're still shooting." The story spread faster than official orders. During the next supply transfer, crews from HMS Beagle rowed alongside HMS Fortitude in the brief calm between storms. A signalman shouted across the gap, "Heard about your cook's fuel cakes. Our lads are dropping like flies. Can you share the recipe?" Thompson was hauled to the bridge. Captain Winters, a man who rarely smiled, studied him with an expression that might have been respect. "They want your recipe, Thompson. Signal them back with the details." Thompson stood at the signal station, dictating ingredients while the signalman translated into Morse code, the lamp flashing across cold water. Oatmeal, beef fat, condensed milk, sugar, mix hot, press flat, cut into squares. The response came minutes later. Received. We'll try. God help us. Within a week, the recipe jumped from ship to ship like a secret handshake. Cooks on merchant vessels tried it with whatever supplies they had, swapping lard for beef fat, molasses for sugar. Some batches were better than others. All of them worked. All of them kept men standing. The bricks became the unofficial meal of the Arctic convoys, passed between galleys in grease-stained notes. Tried your recipe. Crew hasn't mutinied yet. Thanks. Another. My lads call it Thompson's bomb. Tastes like shite, but they're asking for seconds. The medical evidence was undeniable. HMS Fortitude's doctor compiled statistics that told the story better than any testimonial. Before Thompson's improvisation, malnutrition cases averaged 18 per week, with 12% of crew showing symptoms of cold exhaustion. After implementation, malnutrition dropped to 7 cases per week, cold exhaustion to 4%. Frostbite injuries requiring hospitalization fell by 35%. The numbers didn't lie. Ship's surgeon, Lieutenant Harrison, submitted a report to the Admiralty. The improvised high-calorie ration developed by Chief Petty Officer Thompson has proven more effective at maintaining crew combat readiness than any ministry-approved protocol. Daily caloric intake has increased from approximately 3,200 to an estimated 4,800 calories per man. The ration's high-fat content provides sustained energy release. Its solid form prevents freezing and allows consumption during active operations. Recommend immediate fleet-wide adoption. The report was marked received and filed. What the Admiralty wouldn't officially acknowledge, the fleet adopted anyway. On HMS Beagle, their cook modified the recipe, adding dried peas ground into powder for extra protein. On the freighter, SS Empire Lawrence, they mixed in cod liver oil. The recipe evolved, adapted, grew stronger with each iteration. By autumn 1944, hundreds of ships bore the marks of unauthorized innovation. One man's rebellion had become an entire fleet's instinct. The transformation wasn't just physical. Thompson's bricks changed something deeper, something about morale and trust. Sailors knew that someone was fighting for them, not with weapons, but with whatever tools he had. The galley became a refuge. Men lingered near the hatch between watches, drawn by warmth and the knowledge that someone cared whether they lived or died. Even First Lieutenant Ashford, the officer who'd mocked Thompson's initial request, changed his tune. He passed through the galley one morning and paused, looking at the rows of bricks cooling on racks. He met Thompson's eyes. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Ashford nodded once. "Carry on, Thompson." It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. The cook who didn't fight the war with soup had proven that sometimes survival was strategy. Sometimes the man in the galley saved more lives than the man on the bridge. By the time the Arctic convoys concluded their missions in May 1945, Thompson's improvised fuel cake had kept an estimated 15,000 sailors combat-ready through conditions that should have killed them. The official record would never reflect it. But the men who'd eaten those bricks, who'd felt warmth spread through frozen limbs, who'd made it home to families they thought they'd never see again, they knew, they remembered. Section 6. Aftermath and Legacy. Word count 525. Thompson's war ended not with medals, but with a transfer. In July 1944, he was rotated to a supply depot in Portsmouth, where he cooked for sailors who'd never seen ice thicker than frost on a beer mug. It was warm, safe, and utterly hollow. He followed recipes from official manuals and felt like a fraud. The other cooks treated him like a curiosity. "You're the fuel cake bloke, did it really work?" Thompson looked at these men who'd spent the war far from anything that could kill them and felt a gulf open. "Yeah," he said simply, "it worked." Letters arrived occasionally. Sailors from the Fortitude, from the Beagle, from merchant vessels he'd never served on. Brief, awkward, written in pencil. Still using your recipe. Made it through another run. Thanks, Cookie. He kept them in a biscuit tin. Proof that what he'd done mattered, even if London didn't care. The official recognition never came. Thompson submitted his report through proper channels in September 1944. Improvised high-calorie ration for Arctic operations. It included testimonials, medical statistics, and the captain's endorsement. A supply officer in the War Office read it during lunch. He was a man who'd never been to sea, who'd spent the war in offices allocating tonnage. He stamped the report not approved and wrote in the margin, "Field modifications undermine supply chain integrity." The report was filed, not destroyed, just buried in a cabinet where it would gather dust alongside 1,000 other small desperations. No one in London wanted to admit that doctrine had failed, that survival had come from disobedience. But what the War Office rejected, history preserved. The first reunion happened in 1949 in a Liverpool pub. 20 men gathered, faces older, but eyes still carrying the Arctic. When Thompson walked in, someone shouted his name. "Thompson! Billy Bloody Thompson!" A sailor he barely recognized grabbed him in a bear hug. "You mad bastard, you're alive." More men turned. "That's the cook, the one with the bricks." They told stories he didn't remember. "You saved my life in 44. I'd been on watch 12 hours, couldn't feel my hands. You brought me that brick, and I thought, this tastes like hell, but I made it through another watch." Another. "My ship copied your recipe. We made it to Murmansk because of you." The reunions became annual. They met in pubs and union halls, these men who'd sailed through frozen hell. And always, someone would bring Thompson's recipe, copied, modified, passed down like scripture. "My dad used this. This kept us alive. Remember that mad cook?" Thompson died in 1983 in a small Portsmouth flat, surrounded by letters from men he'd fed and a plaque that called him a hero. His obituary mentioned his naval service in one line. Nothing about the galley, the bricks, the men who'd survived because of him. But decades later, a researcher found his report in the naval archives. The story began to emerge from the dust. Academic papers were written. Museums acquired recipe cards. The Imperial War Museum placed one behind glass with a small placard. Emergency ration, improvised, used extensively on Arctic convoy routes, 1944 to 1945. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't justice. But it was memory. And memory, sometimes, is what matters most. War stories celebrate the gunners, the pilots, the commanders who shaped history with strategy and steel. Those stories matter. They deserve to be told. But so do the others. The stories of men who fought with ladles instead of rifles, who saved lives with improvisation instead of ammunition. William Thompson never commanded a destroyer, never flew a Spitfire, never charged a beach under fire. He stood in an 8-foot galley and mixed oatmeal with beef fat because regulation rations were killing his crew as surely as any U-boat. He broke rules because following them meant watching men die. And when the War Office dismissed his innovation as absurd, when doctrine labeled his improvisation as unacceptable, he kept cooking anyway. 15,000 sailors came home because one cook refused to accept that following procedure was more important than keeping men alive. That's not a footnote to the Arctic convoys. That's the whole story in miniature. The truth that bureaucracies always forget and warriors always remember. Superior logistics matters more than superior firepower. Thompson's bricks weren't elegant. They weren't officially sanctioned. They probably didn't taste particularly good. But they worked. And in the frozen hell of the Barents Sea, where the temperature could kill faster than any weapon, Working was all that mattered. Sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is ignore the manual and trust his instincts. Not out of rebellion, but because the situation demands solutions that rigid procedure would prevent. Remember the cook who proved it. The ice never forgets, neither should we. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.